Hey everyone, continuing from week two's lecture, we will be exploring the early history of museums here. In the last lecture, we have discussed the different impulses to collect and the assembling of a collection as serving different purposes, whether they are aesthetic or they serve specific class agendas or maybe specific political ideology. More importantly, we also considered how the collection itself expresses these larger social cultural ideas and contexts. In many ways, the origin of the museum stems from a similar impulse to collect, but its expression and function have emerged out of a specific context in European history. It is also rooted in a type of collecting culture. This collecting culture began sometime with the cultural shift in an intellectual paradigm that is often called the Renaissance around the 14th and 15th century. Now, I'm stretching this back a little, back to the Renaissance period, where a lot of the activity took place around Italy in different cities, where wealthy mercantile families across different towns in Italy started to become patrons for artists, scholars, and scientists. Elsewhere, royal families also became patrons of the arts and sciences. Renaissance as a new intellectual paradigm meant something quite specific. It stems from the word naissance, which means beginning, and adding the word re as a prefix gives us the meaning of Renaissance as rebirth. Intellectuals saw themselves as contributing to the rebirth of an older knowledge that is known as the classics. Here, the classics refer to Greek sort of like ideas and philosophy of what it means to be sort of human, and a desire for a type of knowledge that focuses on the world that human lived in at the center of one's intellectual inquiry, rather than, say, concerns with the other world that was the emphasis of Christian teachings, for example. Much of Greek philosophy was forgotten in Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire, with this knowledge surviving through the Islamic cultures of the Middle East instead, resulting from exchanges that emerged from both trade, as Arabs were sort of were initially the middlemen in the trade of spices from Southeast Asia to Europe, and then subsequently conflict, resulting in sort of the crusade as a kind of holy war waged by the Christian against the Muslim, in order for the Christians to attempt to take back the Holy Land, Jerusalem, right? Classical sort of like human-centered knowledge through this sort of like both process of trade and conflict slowly found a sort of like moment in which it was promoted through this idea of a rebirth in Europe during the Renaissance period. This knowledge is principally concerned about a very human-centered world rather than the otherworldly or the heavenly sort of like realm, from which we obtain the term the humanities and systems of knowledge, which is called epistemology, where we ask questions about what can be known and how can knowledge be structured. The word theater is often used to describe the structuring of such knowledge. Today, the word theater survives to mean a performance, right? While theater as a performance might have a seemingly different meaning, it shares with the definition of theater as knowledge a similar idea of the display of everything, where everything that is being sort of like displayed has an underlying sort of order or principle, like the actors who know their lines and their cues in a performance. In the theater of knowledge, we can discover a kind of like schema of the universe, or so a lot of these scholars then believe. From this idea stems a very powerful concept in the belief that there is something universal that can be known. So knowledge is not just culturally specific or relative. And secondly, what can be known can be classified through an empirical approach, meaning what can be observed and verified through observation. To answer these questions, scholars, artists, and scientists needed to collect things from around the world. so that they can classify them, verify them, observe them, and know them. Create sort of like systems that would allow things to be sort of like placed in this sort of like universal schema that they're sort of creating. Often they were sponsored and supported by many wealthy merchant patrons, later kings and queens of European countries. These collections were known by a specific name. Often they were back then called Cabinet of Curiosities. And what you see here is an image of, an illustration of a natural history sort of like Cabinet of Curiosity, where you see being sort of like displayed in this antechamber or this hall, various sort of like objects from stuffed animals. You can see the crocodile on the roof there, to various sort of like seashell objects that are stuck on the wall, to taxidermies of sort of like birds. And they are arranged also in a very sort of like idiosyncratic manner, but they were arranged and displayed for the purpose of sort of like instruction or illustration. So you can see the man on the right there standing with a pointing stick, pointing up at the ceiling, describing a set of specimens to a fellow compatriot of his. Therefore, these sort of like exhibition of these objects, of these artifacts, serve a purpose of actually sort of like illustrating what can be observed and verified through observation. And Cabinet of Curiosities were, as the name suggests, a type of a formative sort of like system of classification driven by the collector's sort of curiosities. Often it includes things that are strange and embodies an attitude of wanting to know the world. It also spoke of a time where the world was still strange to European eyes and often filled with wild imaginations such as sea monsters, uncharted or unmapped territories where strange people continue to sort of exist, but also where new discoveries were made there and then, such as the passage across the Atlantic to the American continent. With the sponsorship of sea voyages in search of direct access to the spices of Southeast Asia, they needed this sort of like direct access because they were waging a war against the Muslims. And so as a result, their access to all the very sort of lucrative spices from Southeast Asia was sort of like cut off, right? Because of the search for this sort of like direct access to the spices of Southeast Asia, things collected by traders and sailors along the way often ended up in these cabinets of curiosities. So the spices were principally nutmegs and clove, and they were primarily found on the island of Maluku, or the Moluccas, right? Or as it was known back then. Now, it is important to note that the cabinets were not only set up in Europe. In the 17th century, a German scientist who found himself on one of the Maluku islands, Ambon, did also set up a cabinet of curiosity and publish a book that describes his cabinet. So for example, so I just want to show you other images that you can see here. So there are a lot of different illustrations of different kinds of like cabinet of curiosity. But one that is of interest is dates from the 17th century by this German scientist. His name is George Eberhard Lumpius. In the book that was published in 1705, I wouldn't know how to sort of like pronounce it. It's roughly the Ambonisch Rare Kramer, a book of a rare covered from sort of like Ambon, where he tries to classify different types of seashells that he was collecting in his cabinet. Sadly, his cabinet of curiosity, or the sort of like a proto sort of like museum in the formation, set up in the outlying islands of sort of Ambon, did not survive until today. But the book did and does, and it contains an important documentation that points to what scholars are beginning to call the emergence of a kind of hybrid knowledge. meaning that what we previously thought of as a way of seeing and understanding the world that emerges solely through European eyes and through European perspective actually include a host of other characters and perspectives, often not recorded or not acknowledged or not attributed in the sort of like final intellectual work. Because in an European book, often it only lists the European writer as the sole author, where in fact the knowledge is made up of recorded exchanges with local inhabitants who serve as teachers and informants and guides and assistants. Today, of course, in the sciences, more and more local knowledge partners are recognized as co-producers of knowledge. And therefore, things are sort of like changing today. But I think what this document sort of like capture is that right at the very beginning in which Europe was sort of like beginning to sort of like survey the world through these sort of like new classificatory sort of like knowledge system, we also see these types of system being sort of like transported to different parts of the world where similar sort of like attempts were set up in even in sort of like far-flung places like Ambon. To think about this is to help us to think about the beginning of the pursuit of sort of like knowledge as something that is very hybrid. And in the next sort of like lecture, we will focus on what the museum then sort of like enhances out of these early attempts to sort of like classify what we know about the world.